Well, welcome to UFO Classified. What can I tell you? It's a rainy Friday night here in Utah. My camera's working momentarily. We'll see what sort of turmoil we have happen, and perhaps my big fat cat Mufasa will pay a visit to us this evening. I want to thank everybody for getting in here. I love all of you guys. You know this, Amy, Kassan, Simon. You guys, and the Sparky Lady. All of you guys, and Mario. You mean so much to me. And even though I've never met any of you in person, you're like family to me. And every Friday night is something that I really do look forward to because all of you ask such great questions and you're a huge support to me. And the Sparky Lady, thank you. That is really kind of you for the super sticker. That is awesome. I also want to just reach out and tell Bob McGuire that I am very sorry about his mother passing away. And I want to thank all of the people that support me behind the scenes. As you know, my big love in all of this is archiving. And believe it or not, right now I have over 140,000 documents that need to be scanned and archived to preserve a very important history in the UFO subject. And Ruffle, as you know, I talk about all the time, had 140,000 documents. Can you believe it? Not only that, but probably 50 floppy disks, over 100 audio cassettes, which Dave Marler is helping me digitize. This is going to be so freaking cool. And so this is really an important project. And then I have the work that people have donated to me over the years, like Rich Vitello. If he's listening, I want to give him a shout out. I hope he is feeling good. And then also Jim Klotz, who donated a considerable amount of his life's work collecting archives and periodicals. He's got a website called UFO Pop. You can go check it out. I have a majority of that, and it is such a pleasure for me to pick up some of these old pieces of work and then to look through them. And I've got to just show you a couple things here. This is crazy. So this is, if you can see this from the National Enquirer, startling evidence that beings from another planet visited Earth thousands of years ago. Well, whatever. It is the National Enquirer, and you can always just see how reliable they are, but it's quite interesting. And then eerie pulsating UFO moving at incredible speed. Look at that. And if some of you don't know this, this is kind of cool. This isn't cool, but the National Enquirer they had to destroy all of everything, all of their holdings. And that's an interesting story. I'll have to bring on Barry Greenwood to talk about that. So to have little snippets of the National Archive is quite cool, in my opinion. And then, hey, Sean and Renee and Ken, I love you guys. Good to see you here. And I also have just this little ditty here, the Condon Committee. This is a ton of work that Anne Ruffle did back in the day about the Condon Committee. All of this is original work. It needs to be scanned. Like I said, 140,000 documents. And then I have got folder after folder after folder of correspondence, personal correspondence from the Center of UFO Studies, from MUFON, between Walt Andrus and Anne Ruffle, between Mark Rodiger, between Jacques Vallée and Anne Ruffle, so many things. And it really, in Kehoe, Christmas cards from Dr. Hynek. This is really such a treasure. And so I want to thank the people that contribute to the show, to get in there and hey, Utah, and thanks for checking in from Logan. That's awesome. But I want to thank all of you who donate to the show and get in there and support not only keeping this on the air because it's a listener-supported show, but also helping me preserve history. There are things in here that would really paint an interesting picture. They need to get out to the public. That is my plan. I cannot wait, hopefully, to have a new computer soon to be able to do that, because clearly my 8-year-old computer is quite lovely, but that's okay. So anyway, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm really also, and hey, single wide, I want to just say, yeah, QFO, Sean, oh my gosh, you guys are going to just have a field day when I get to release all of this. And Mario, behind the scenes, I love you. Thank you for everything. Also, before I bring on my guest, I want to just tell you that I'm going to be on the Paracast this Sunday. And this is probably, one of my more spicy interviews. They keep getting spicier because the more I learn about the ranch that shall remain unnamed, the players involved, and the alleged fraudulent activity, the nonsense that goes on there, the more I am apt to speak out about it, because to me it is not only corrupting a community, it is corrupting the UFO community as a whole, but it is also making money for a handful of people. And I want to give a shout out to some of the fanboys. Uh, I would like to say girls, but I'm specifically addressing a couple people here who have recently, and I had all the faith in them in the world, but have recently said, "Hey, guess what? You know what? You know, certain person invited us up there. We're going to go there and jump on that bandwagon." And at the end of the day, all they're going to be doing, I'm quite sure of it, is promoting a fictitious ranch that is based on lies. Sue me. Good luck. I've got my First Amendment rights too. Anyway, thank you. Just had to share that. So anyway, with that little spicy, and I will send you guys the link. I'll share it on Facebook. But with that spicy introduction, I just want to invite or add my guest this evening, Luis Cayetano, to the show. And I've been listening to his interviews or his work on YouTube all day. And he's got a great blog spot called UFOlogy is Corrupt. And he and I are very similar in the things that we've discovered, the things that we want to bring out to the public in order to help the public make better decisions about what they're going to believe and some of the rabbit holes they're going to go down. And I thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And I wish we could see your face, but I know you're having computer problems just like I am. But you tell us, because your background is incredible. And I think most people would just be mind blown to know about it. And so, will you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, I wouldn't say it's mind blowing, but
to
it's
me, it is.
fairly interesting. My background's in evolutionary ecology, and not very much to do with UFOs at all. But I've always been interested in critical thinking and how do we know things. Right, so epistemological questions about how do we actually know about the world and how do we know that certain things are true or not true. And that's sort of how I got into UFOs. Or I guess I was always interested in UFOs to an extent, for the typical reasons that people are. They just are fascinated by the idea of extraterrestrial life. And, in the 1990s, I was very much into all that stuff as well, with the X-Files and all the UFO explosion in the media at the time. But, I became more skeptical and just went on to do my education in biology. But then, more recently I've sort of circled back on the UFO stuff. But for nothing to do with the biology, really. It's just for the scientific critical thinking / epistemology side of things.
Well, I mean, it really is a fascinating subject. Whether ET is here or not, there's so many areas to look at. And I mentioned on the Paracast of my show, we pre-recorded it, but how grateful I am to have be involved in this subject, because the history is so fascinating. The people are fascinating. I've learned a lot about many, many different areas. And so it really has for the better enriched me as a person. And I've also met some really incredible people and a couple dingbats, well, who am I kidding? Probably at least 50.
Yeah, there are many dingbats for sure.
And I love, like I said, I was listening to you on YouTube today, and you talk a little bit about, what did you call them? The dude bros?
The dude bros.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the meatheads.
The meatheads, yeah.
It just sums it up so perfectly. And you also talk a lot about the fact that, we are in this subject, the community, we're supposed to be love and full of love and light, and we're saving the world, and we're such kind human beings. And yet when you get on Twitter, as you pointed out, you see people's behavior, and it's really anything but love and light. So that's kind of a farcical thing
Yeah.
that people like to cling on to.
Twitter's pretty toxic anyway. It can, I've said many things on Twitter that I'm not proud of, and I'm not really on Twitter anymore, but it's certainly a platform which invites toxicity and belligerence. But certainly there are a lot of people who kind of get onto that platform in order to be toxic and to kind of attack people instead of inform people.
I agree. I rarely post on Twitter because it's just you get these people, yeah, or whatever they are. I mean, people that obviously don't have a life or need some sort of support system, medication, things like that that are in there and are very toxic, and it's not good, you know. And I look at UFO Twitter as something that's just not even going to happen. I'm not going to engage in those people. So,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
But okay, so let's talk a little bit about. I'm going to share the screen with you if you want to do a screen share coming up pretty
I'll
quick.
do
I
it.
want to talk a little
Should I do it
bit.
now from my end?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that'll be awesome. And
Okay.
hey, Phil, and B Baker and Jim, you are up early. I love it. And Peter, thank you for promoting the show on social media. You guys are amazing. Okay, so let's see. We're going to add you to the stream. Okay,
Okay.
so let's see some of your fantastic charts.
So these are just charts that I made in a program called lucid.app. So let me just show you actually. This is the app, and I forget how much it costs. The subscription is a few dollars a year, I think. It's about $20 or something. But this is used by business people and anyone who really wants to make charts of any variety for any purpose. But I just got the idea of making charts to kind of map the UFO scene because it gets really confusing. You can read a book and it's got personalities and people and associations, but it's kind of hard to keep in your head all at once. So I thought that it would be a good idea to visualize it. So that's what this lets you do, right? And you can add shapes here and arrows and stuff. You can edit them up here. So this is I'll just, and you can convert these to JPEGs or other file types, right? But so that's how they're made. And I've just been making these charts to kind of map out certain narratives within the UFO field, like including this one's about Skinwalker, or as you say, the ranch that shall not be named. But it just shows some of the personalities involved, including Robert Bigelow. You know, he keeps cropping up again and again. And, you know, the association with ATIP and ORSAP and BAS, the DIA and the DOD more generally, also NIDS, and many of the scientists and other personalities that we've heard of, including Eric Davis, Kit Green, Colm Kelleher, and of course, there's also George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, who have been pushing these stories a lot recently. Also, John B. Alexander, I think he's a colonel, right? Or he was a colonel in the army, and he's been involved in some interesting research into non-lethal weapons and stuff like that. But a big UFO proponent. But yeah, let's see. There's also this one charting the TTSA NIDS ATIP saga. Okay, again, you've got Robert Bigelow. And by the way, you've got these arrows pointing between people, but it doesn't mean that they're in cahoots with each other. It just means that they're in some way associated with each other. So that could be a deep link, or it could just be an acquaintance, and that's potentially problematic because it could give the impression that these people are closely tied together, but that's not necessarily what I'm trying to convey. So I have to think of a way of conveying that a little bit better. But, you know, obviously these get very complicated. There's also a question about exactly who to include and who to exclude, because, you know, eventually you're going to include every person on Earth because everyone's connected. So you have to sort of keep it constricted by using some criteria. Right. This one I updated recently to include a few things. I added John Ramirez, and a few links to Jim Semivan, I'm sorry, who's another scientist who's been involved in this whole saga. There's also a lot of overlap between the ATIP stuff and the Skinwalker stuff. So that's another challenge in making these charts, is deciding, how not to make the charts too similar to each other, because then they just become copies of each other. But sometimes it's tricky because these people keep cropping up again and again. You've also got here Bob Lazar, who is not specifically tied to the ATIP story, but he is tied to George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, who have certainly drawn succor from the ATIP story. And TTSA actually published Lazar's so-called autobiography, so I include him there as well. You've got SRI International, and its links to the Central Intelligence Agency, and also Uri Geller, who is tied to Jacques Vallée. And Jacques Vallée is another person who keeps cropping up because he's one of the dons of ufology, and he's pushing the kind of consciousness aspect of UFOs. This one's about some of the hypnosis controversies around David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins. Surprise, surprise, Robert Bigelow appears again. Okay, this also involved MUFON and a scandal involving the release of documents without the knowledge of the patients, okay, because Robert Bigelow wanted information about the hypnosis sessions, and they were given to him, I believe, by David Jacobs, but that was done without the knowledge of the people that he was interviewing. This one's about the Paul Benowitz affair. So Richard Doty, who also keeps cropping up, he's also associated with Hal Pathoff, but back in the day, he was, his story is more about the Afosi saga involving Paul Benowitz and the disinformation / counterintelligence operation, which was ostensibly done on Paul Benowitz to distract him from stuff happening at Kirtland Air Force Base. Okay. So a lot of this information is taken from books that I've read, including Jack Brewer's books and some other people. And I try to also find corroborating evidence in freely available sources. And if I'm not sure about a link, I'll ask people if that's actually true, that these people are linked, and then they can confirm it for me. But ultimately, I want to be able to make these tables or these graphs such that you can click on one of the links and it'll bring up information to corroborate that these people are indeed in some way linked together. It's also got institutions that these people are associated with. Okay. And again, I don't want to give the impression that the institutions are in on any UFO conspiracies. It's simply that these people have been in the employ or in some other way associated with those institutions or organizations.
Interestingly enough, I just have to interrupt you, and I'm sorry, but Chris Marks actually worked for the New Mexico State Police.
Yes.
Throwing that in there.
I'll put that in. But sometimes people meet each other when they're working for organizations, and that's how they know each other. So potentially that's how they can develop an association which is relevant to the UFO topic specifically, but maybe not. So these are just ways of visualizing these links, but you have to dig deeper to find out exactly what is the nature of that link. Okay. And this one's about the NICAP story. So this is drawing heavily from Jack Brewer's work, but also some other sources. And he wrote a book called Wayward Sons, which is about the people in NICAP, many of whom were from the Central Intelligence Agency or who had worked in the CIA, and some of them worked in psychological warfare operations. And I find that very interesting. And as he notes, it is interesting that so many people had that sort of background. And, you can take from that whatever you want, but he's currently in the process of getting more documents through FOIA and looking at newspaper clippings from back in the day and stuff like that to try to put the pieces together. So I think that's very interesting about what these people were actually doing in NICAP. Was it just a casual association in terms of people being interested in UFOs for personal reasons, or was there some sort of institutional goal being served?
And that is
Okay.
interesting. And Anne Druffel worked with
Yep.
NICAP, but obviously I don't think she wasn't working with the intelligence community. She was just a researcher that really believed in what she was doing. And so it is, like I said, it's so fascinating to read the correspondence between her and Kehoe and some of these figures, Stuart Nixon and Gordon Lohr, and some of the people that you have listed in your charts. That really is very telling. So I'm looking forward to getting that out to the public.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. And I'm currently working on some other ones, including the Lazar story and uh, William Cooper and people like that who have been associated with Bob Lazar and some other stories as well. But, all of these charts could be linked together actually into one super chart, which I may do in the future because, it's surprising the extent to which some of these people are really central to all of these narratives.
It
So
is
that's
really
what I've got.
interesting.
Hmm. That's
No,
what
and
I'm,
I love that.
the ones
That's really important. And Cindy, was just mentioning in here how she's been doing this in her mind. I think I've been doing this on paper and putting together, links and people, and it really does kind of boil down to, a certain group of people over the years and things, and that really is fascinating. What are the motivations? Is this a disinformation? Are they? I mean, what's happening? Are there just people that are like I believe Lazar and his uh, buddies, they're just on a big grift, and things. And
Mhm.
so, what are the motivations? Who's behind them? I don't know. It's really fascinating. What do you think?
I think there's, as Jack Brewer mentioned in your interview with him recently, that there's many different motivations. So some people are grifting and other people are naive. They're just doing it because they want to believe something to be true, and they're not really paying attention to the evidence. Then you've got some other people who think that they've got good evidence for something, but they don't necessarily put the information into peer-reviewed papers. So even there, it's questionable. But at least some people arguably have got more pure motivations than others. But there certainly seems to be a core of people who do have been in this game for a long time, and they seem to be up to something not very nice or not very good.
You know, I will say from my personal experience, as clearly everybody who listens to the show and listen to the Paracast and my other interviews know that I can, safely say that the people I've come in contact with involved with a ranch that shall not be named, they're not very nice people. They're not up to anything good. I don't think Davis and Bigelow and that whole crew are genuinely good people. I used to think that, but think I don't think you can blatantly fool the public and try to manipulate so many people and be inherently a good person. Maybe you
Yeah, I
can,
would tend to agree. Hmm.
but okay. So keep going with your charts because I think we're fascinated.
Well, those are the ones I've got
Okay.
right now, which are sort of complete. They're not really complete because these are always a little bit out of date because more information always comes in. Um, but these are the ones which are more or less finished for now. But I'll put up some more soon when I'm done with those. Um, and I also invite people to correct me when they see something which is not, they think something's wrong or there's extra connections that I should make. So on my website, I do encourage that for them to contact me when they see something which should be fixed or should be amended. But I don't know. I could talk about any one of these if you want. in more detail.
Yeah, no, I mean, pick one because I'm fascinated by everything that you do. Let's actually, yeah, let's look at I don't know. What do we think? Yep, do the well, I mean, you're zooming in on
This one's the ranch that shall not be named.
yes.
And here you are, Erica. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's
You're in this
okay.
chart. But again, this does not imply malevolent intent. It's just an
Right.
association, right? So, you know, uh, I mentioned George Knapp. He's been in the UFO game for decades now, famously with the Bob Lazar story. But more recently, he wrote a book with Colm Kelleher about Skinwalker and the Pentagon. And he seems to be in a sort of different camp to Luis Elizondo. As to the nature of ATIP and ORSAP, um, there's some controversy about exactly what Elizondo's role was in that program and when he was actually part of it. Okay, there seems to be disagreement between him and his supporters and George Knapp. So that's an interesting thing in itself, that you can get these little cliques forming and little factions forming, right? Doesn't mean any of them are the good guys, by the way. It just means that there are different, groups with different agendas. John
Right. And
B.
I've got a
Alexander. Yep.
oh, sorry, go ahead. Keep going.
No, go ahead, please.
No, just I just had a question from Simon who wanted to know about the Oath Keepers. So,
Oh yeah.
and
Oh
I
yeah.
would love
Well,
to
you might have more to
explain
say
that.
about that than I do.
Yeah, I do, having been married to somebody that was a part of the Oath Keepers. Much to my dismay, the Oath Keepers is a militia movement. Very interestingly enough, the founder of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, has made numerous appearances on Coast to Coast AM, which I find quite interesting. They were part of the Capitol insurrection and are, quite an interesting group of people that have been deemed a terrorist organization. So just fascinating connection.
Yes. Hmm. There's some other, as you mentioned that there are some other indications of white supremacist or far right links in all of this. Um, you've got Brandon Fugal, who used to be part of the Ancient History Research Foundation, which pushes certain narratives about the mounds, and some other stuff like that. So revisionist history about the ancient world. And this organization once had one of its members was Frank Joseph, who was the founder of the American Nazi Party. But that doesn't mean that Fugal is a Nazi. It just means that he was part of a group which had some questionable, let's say, relationships with the truth, and that was, included some fascists in it. But as to what that says about Fugal, his ideology, I wouldn't want to make any, definitive determinations about that. But it
Well,
is
and it is.
perhaps suggestive.
I mean, it is interesting, and I think that's alarming. And I know that what Jason Colavito you were mentioning wrote a blog about this issue and asked Fugel directly about this. Of course, Fugel denied that he was a part of this at any, that he had. I mean, tell us what he said in that.
Oh, I think Fugal said that he had been part of that group, but not at the time that Joseph was in it. I think that's what Colavito was told by Fugal.
That makes it better.
Mm-hmm. I hope so.
Yeah.
But there's also been some questions about Bigelow's attitude, and I don't know if I can talk about that.
Yeah.
Erica.
Yeah.
Well, there's a case involving a African American man working at Skinwalker. He'd been working as a caretaker for a very short time, I think just a few days, and then Bigelow visited the ranch and basically immediately fired him. And there's a court case. I don't know if it's still going through the courts, but that's another warning sign or red flag in this whole saga.
And I think that from my understanding, looking at that, he was a security guard in Vegas, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, that was mentioned, and there are a few interesting court cases with regard to issues like that, which are alarming. And there are also some very interesting internal memos that, you know,
Yes.
I've seen, which I will not disclose. But anyway, it is quite interesting, and um, it is alarming. And then you look at ufology as a whole, and you think it, it's an interesting group of older white men.
Hmm.
I don't know what to say. Uh,
Older white rich men with conservative ideology, sometimes far right ideology. So there's also Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, and he's associated with this whole thing as well. So he's apparently shown some interest in UFOs, and Colavito also wrote a piece about him. But yeah, Thiel is, he's really into this far right stuff, unfortunately, and that's another red flag.
I mean, to me, it absolutely is, and it's interesting because I hear a couple people in the UFO sphere say that he's just being conned by some of these other people in ufology, and I don't think so. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. This is a way to
Hmm.
manipulate people. He's an incredibly brilliant man who has an agenda, and we have seen the way people can buy and sell information, and get on Facebook and look at somebody's profile, learn how to manipulate them, and then create a lot of discontent just by doing that. So data is big money, and where has all of this, so as a lot of this started, in my opinion, the conspiracy culture and things, and
Hmm.
you know, makes sense to me as to why he would want to get into the subject.
Yeah, especially now where you've got all these far right stories about how the government is run by left wing or Marxist elites, and that white people are being oppressed and so on. So a lot of this stuff is actually, well, the audience is kind of primed to hearing messages about these kind of alarmist racial stories with these sorts of undertones. But Bigelow has been in this thing for a long time. He actually is also linked to Bob Lazar because he, for a short time, had a company with Bob Lazar called Zeta Reticuli Incorporated, I think it was, until Lazar couldn't deliver the goods, and then it was too ridiculous even for Bigelow, which tells you something. But Bigelow is very much interested in the question of consciousness, and he recently awarded, I think, $500,000 to Jeffrey Mishlove, who's a parapsychologist, and a couple of other people got runner-up prizes of a few $100,000 each as well. So he's very much into the consciousness question and the afterlife question,
Mhm.
and he wants to link this somehow to Skinwalker and to UFOs. He was, of course, the previous owner of Skinwalker, and for whatever reason, he relinquished ownership of that ranch. Who knows? Maybe he just got sick of nothing actually appearing or being verified, or could be some other reason. But it seems like the current supposed owner, or at least administrator of Skinwalker, Mr. Fugal, he also has a sort of similar bent to it as well. So trying to find the kind of paranormal, consciousness-based phenomena going on.
I definitely think, having a scientific study where the first episode of your TV show is saying a prayer when you're going over the ranch, it's clearly, or,
Yeah.
or naming, baby alpacas, showing that on TV. I'm sure that's very scientific. I really think that's cool.
Hmm.
Well, that's the interesting thing is the intersection between this kind of reality TV show format with a lot of UFO material and Diana Pasulka, who's also involved in this whole saga. She's also written a very interesting book about UFOs, much of which I don't agree with, but she does raise some interesting points about the role of the media and technology in pushing the UFO narrative and shaping it. And she talks about the psychological effects of viewing movie style documentaries, and it makes it more difficult for people to separate fact from fiction. So that choice of a reality TV show type format could have been strategic on Fugal's part, or maybe he just automatically, unconsciously gravitated towards that style.
Well, I mean, they've got a third season, and I will say that I do watch the show mostly because I need some comedy in my life. But,
Mhm. Yeah, I haven't watched it yet, but I definitely will. I should hear it from the horse's mouth, like what exactly they're saying and what sort of experimental procedures and so on they're using. Pretty sure that they're not using any proper controls, which you would have to use in a proper scientific experiment. But
and,
there seems to
and
be a lot of shortcomings with their approach, to
to,
put it
and,
mildly.
to put it mildly, and so let's talk a little bit about, what would really need to take place in a something that is a scientific endeavor.
You need to have experts from different fields, preferably, I would say more than two, at least two for each specialty. So different kinds of radiation, uh, geology, topography, and so on, biology. And then you would have to have, uh, the equipment would have to be adequate and properly calibrated. You would have to have a regime where you've got control to compare your results against. So you would do the same sorts of procedures, but in a geographical area which is not thought to be haunted by paranormal activity, for example.
Hmm.
And those sorts of things have to be implemented. And then they have to use proper statistical methods so that you're not just squinting when you're looking at the results and saying, yeah, that looks more or less than that. It has to be a properly statistically based study. And, I think some people have done this with the Hesdalen, for example, the Hesdalen lights is it in Norway?
Hmm.
In Norway, or is it
Yes,
Sweden?
it's Norway.
Norway. Yeah, they've at least, I mean, whatever you think of the phenomena there, they've at least tried to do that, those sorts of procedures. So that's what you would need. But, we haven't seen any results yet uh, from Skinwalker, so it's hard to judge whether they are actually living up to those expectations.
Well, and I think, yeah, I mean, well, I mean, obviously nothing's happened. It's been since 2016,
Mhm.
and there's been no uh, data. I mean, it's just, yeah, it was started as an entertainment company. It's entertainment,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so I think at some point in time, people have got to get over that. And I know that it's really cool when somebody, like Fugal, approaches you and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so lucky. This is so cool. He's inviting me into his realm and he's opening up his kimono, which is one of his favorite phrases. Um, but it's okay, great. He's a businessman. I mean, he's kind and, I mean, I've had great conversations with him and wonderful dinners and things and I've enjoyed the time that I've spent with him. But again, it's a there's a business here. There's a, a shtick, and there are a lot of other things that go on. Like I try to point out when I'm posting things on Facebook and on social media about Senator Tom Winterton, about some of the tax breaks he's getting for specific industry in the Uinta Basin, and there's a lot going on in that little area, and it's
Hmm.
about real estate. It's about I mean, industry. It's politics, and so people should not be so naive to think that this is simply a person or a group of people who are just really excited about this study that are going in to do something really cool. There's a lot more that people need to get a grip on. And,
Hmm.
like I said, I mean, great, you're a fanboy. Admit you're a fanboy and get out of the way of people that really want to make a difference in this subject.
Well, something that you mentioned actually resonates with some other things I've been looking into, which is the astroturfing aspect. So, astroturfing, in case your viewers don't know, is when you fake a grassroots movement. So you make it look like it's something that the people want, but it's actually being funded by and for the benefit of rich people, basically. So, by sidelining the scientific process and just going for a um, movie style documentary slash reality TV show format when
Mm.
presenting this information, so-called information, they're kind of sticking it to the scientific establishment in a way, and just saying that what the people believe is what matters, not what science says. So it could be a kind of populist grift in that sense, where you're appealing to the lowest common denominator, people's base beliefs or desires, and you're just kind of saying this is the truth, and the scientific community doesn't want to pay attention to it because they're too elite or too uh, obnoxious or whatever to care what the people think. But in reality, the ultimate goal for it is something which is going to benefit not the people, but whoever is funding all this stuff.
Right. And if then that's the whole point. It's like if you think this is if you think there isn't money to be made behind the scenes and things, then you're completely up in the night, Come on.
Mm-hmm.
This is reality. What's going on in
Yeah.
the Uinta Basin is there's a lot of moving parts there. So
Yes. You've got some other companies involving Hal Pothoff and others. I think I bring this out more in one of the other charts. Let me see. Oh yeah, Earth Tech International or Incorporated and Sapphire Project, which is based on this pseudoscientific idea about the plasma universe or the electric universe, and that's almost completely rejected by actual astronomers and physicists. But this company basically hasn't done anything. But Pothoff is one of the board members or one of the people in that company. So there's these sorts of side grifts or side projects which are kind of questionable as well, not just the central UFO stuff.
and that yeah, the whole thing is so fascinating just to see. And when you look at this, it's
Mhm.
I'm really grateful that you've put this together, and we can keep as more information comes in, like you said, we can add and subtract to the charts and make a clear link. And I definitely think doing um, a chart on the connections, perhaps the political connections, the business dealings in the Uinta Basin would be quite shocking to people who are who are supporting the ranch that shall not be named,
Mhm.
circus sideshow.
There's also the Galileo project that I should mention. So this has also become embroiled in this whole saga because of let's see, Luis Elizondo is one of the consultants for the Galileo project, and it was founded by Avi Loeb, who's a Stanford physicist, legitimate, astrophysicist. He pushed the what's it called, the that object that passed into the solar system, Oumuamua,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
which is still controversial among physicists and astronomers as to what it actually was. Almost everyone, all the experts believe that it's a natural object, but Avi Loeb has been sort of the maverick and tried to say that it's evidence of alien technology. But anyway, whatever the status of that is, he's kind of jumped on board the UFO bandwagon, and the Galileo project is about trying to get a really high resolution photograph of a UFO, and then obviously that could be proof that there are aliens visiting the Earth. If you could get a really high resolution photo of an actual spacecraft, instead of what we get all the time, which is blurry photos and things which are not really distinguishable from background clutter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's what the Galileo project is about, and it's sort of jumping on board the bandwagon, and I think maybe a little bit opportunistically as well, because initially Avi Loeb's take was that UFOs are actually probably not extraterrestrial because they're always on the edge of credibility, because we get better and better optics and cameras, and the ubiquity of cameras is now incredible with mobile phones and digital cameras, and nearly everyone's got one. And yet we only ever get UFOs which are, they're not clearly what they're meant to be, alien spacecraft. So now he's saying that, if we can get really, really good, telescopes and stuff to point at a UFO, then we might get a good picture of a spacecraft. But that seems to me almost a little bit of a contradiction from his earlier position. Also, the Oumuamua object, he was saying that it was being propelled by the light from the sun. So it's like a solar sail, which is one proposal for how to get interstellar travel.
Mm-hmm.
Is to have the this sort of really thin sail being pushed by photons, and then eventually that would, slowly accelerate you out of the solar system. But that's very, very different to the propulsion systems which UFO proponents claim are powering the spacecraft that are entering the atmosphere of, Earth's atmosphere. So again, that seems to me a contradiction. But he's got like different people consulting him. Some people, I think, are being paid, but other ones are just unpaid consultants, and different viewpoints. So I think Mick West is one of the consultants, but so are proponents like Luis Elizondo and Nick Pope, okay, who's also been in the UFO game for a long time.
Jeez. Okay. Sorry. I mean, like, this doesn't surprise me. This is the usual cast of characters. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I've got to breathe deeply, and I want to just go back because I'm loving some of the comments you guys are making in chat tonight. As always, you guys are really amazing. And Steve Long just mentions, turns out Bigelow didn't dig on Skinwalker Ranch because he legally couldn't. He didn't buy the mineral rights. Steve wonders if Hugel did know. Actually, the Myers family owns the mineral rights under the ranch, so that's why they can't dig. But I know it's better to say they can't dig because somebody's, scalp is going to separate from their skull and different things. I mean, anyway, thanks for letting me just talk about that. So, and I want to look at your chart and mention Daniel Inouye. And, he was involved, I mean, is there an MK Ultra link in here to any of this that would go back that far?
Oh, perhaps, yes. Let me see. Might have to look at the NICAP chart. I'm not actually sure about the MK Ultra connection to Skinwalker, to ATIP.
I just think it's interesting. Like I mentioned, that's put off and things got their initial batch. TARG got their initial batch of funding at SRI from Sidney Gottlieb. Mr.
That's
MK
right.
Ultra, and then you've got what I believe the Church Commission that was looking into the MK Ultra and things, and I believe Daniel Inouye was involved in some of that back in the early 70s. I think I want to say 74. I could be wrong, but
was he investigating the CIA for the Congress, or?
There was an investigation about MK Ultra and how all of miraculous, or how all these documents allegedly were destroyed and nobody could figure out what was going on. But it is really interesting to see some of the same people that were involved with that, who were involved with Harry Reid, who were involved with Bigelow and Puthoff and things. I mean, there's some connections there. I think maybe a chart on MK Ultra and
Yeah.
that, a point in the 70s would be late
Mhm.
60s, early 70s would be really, really interesting.
Yeah. And thanks for reminding me about Hal, because he's obviously, part of the remote viewing investigations for SRI International and the CIA. And yeah. So again, this kind of links back to the consciousness aspect and, programs to develop psychic spies. And there was actually a story, I think it might have been emanated from Hal, but could have been some other person in the SRI program who mentioned that there had been a remote viewing of aliens on Mars, like that they'd seen back in time to a civilization on Mars. And, I don't know how the program could have kept going after those sorts of sci-fi, injections, but I guess it shows sort of the role of wishful thinking in some of this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I think more will keep coming out about these people. And Uri Geller's a fascinating person as well. And I
Mm-hmm.
found a bunch of old newspaper clippings from that time period with Uri Geller and things. And then, John Podesta. How does John Podesta really, how does he play into this? Was he a willing participant, or was he somebody that was approached by Tom DeLonge and this group of people and knowing that WikiLeaks would do their big dump and John Podesta's emails would be in there?
It could be both. I think John Podesta is probably not super interested in UFOs, but he thinks maybe there is a case to be made for them, and he was approached by DeLonge, who could have kind of regurgitated his own beliefs back to him to an extent. But let's see, this link here. This goes back to Leslie Keane, who's also been prominent.
Hmm.
And
And Leslie Keane and Chris Mellon. I mean, all of these people. When you look into their family backgrounds, I mean, these are some pretty serious families in political positions of power. Generation after generation. So
yes,
I guess we might not want to look at that, but
well, I do. But she is also interested in the consciousness aspect because she wrote a book about UFOs, and she also more recently wrote a book about ESP and the afterlife. So again, you see this theme cropping up again and again, not just from scientists but also journalists involved in this whole thing. There's also Annie Jacobson,
mhm.
who's a friend of Uri Geller, and she wrote a book about Area 51. She interviewed Bob Lazar for that book as well. And her book about Area 51 was pretty good. I mean, I read it myself and I thought it was pretty good. But the chapter about the Stalin Mengele flying saucer, that was complete nonsense. And I think she just allowed herself to get completely carried away by that story. But she's also interested in psychic spies, and she's written a book about the Pentagon and I think the CIA's program to develop psychic spying. So again, another consciousness link. But yeah, I'm just trying to remember John Podesta, what exactly. So this CFI organization, I'm trying to remember what that stands for. It's not the Clinton Foundation. It's something else. I think it's to do with consciousness or with UFOs, but it's something to do with paranormal investigations. And I think he was a member of that organization, or he was associated with it somehow.
I can't help but wonder, again, here's Podesta and then all these emails that are coming through that are leaked again that are I mean, I don't know. There's something fishy about what happened with that. And so that'd be interesting to dig into
Mhm.
that if you could, but
Yeah, and I think a great source of a great source of information for that is Greenwald's research,
mhm.
because he's done a lot of background on ATIP and these people. So I'm gonna check out his stuff to keep this investigation going.
That's amazing. And Phil, yes, I'm just trying to look at your email, which is very difficult, but I will definitely look at that. We need to chat sometime soon, Phil, hopefully. And so, yeah, Steve, I mean, there really is something fishy here. Cybernetic Futures Institute. Thank you. Is that what it
Oh
is?
yeah, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yes, I have to double check that, but I'm
Interesting.
pretty sure
Okay.
That's the
Thank you,
organization.
Drew. Yes, and IBM. I mean, you right there. Jan Harzan should be on that list.
Mm-hmm.
So the executive director of MUFON, who was high up at IBM.
I don't remember if
So,
Jacques Vallée as well might have been with IBM at some point, but he's he worked on the development of the internet back in the day, and he certainly brings a cybernetic view to things. Jacques Vallée is
interesting.
also in this graph right here. So he's linked with tons of people, including, of course, Robert Bigelow and Bass and NIDS. But he's also been linked to Uri Geller and SRI. And Jacques Vallée is really interesting because his view has kind of evolved over time. So initially, he was a proponent of the extraterrestrial hypothesis for UFOs. Then he wrote a book called Passport to Magonia, which was about the similarities between paranormal encounters in antiquity and, or at least before the 20th century, and with the UFO phenomenon. And he noted like many similarities between them. Um, and his take has been that there's an underlying similar cause to them, which is a non-human cause. So he thinks in terms of interdimensional beings, okay, which are causing different people to have different visions at different periods in the world's history. So I mean, I don't buy that at all, but that's his take. More recently, he's amplified the crash narrative with his book with Paola Harris. The book is called Trinity, and
Yes,
he
that
talks
was.
about a crash happening shortly after the nuclear explosion at in New Mexico in the late 1940s. Or when was it? The 1945. Um, and it's kind of a strange evolution of his take, because initially he'd been kind of very reticent to talk about to credit the crash narrative because he thought it was a distraction from a larger truth. But now, for some reason, he's affirming the crash narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think people that have followed his work over the decades have been very surprised that towards the end of his
Yeah.
career, that he would jump on that bandwagon. I think that was very disappointing to some people.
But I mean, he's also made many claims which are kind of dodgy or difficult to credit, because he also mentioned, in the context of the manipulation hypothesis or the control system hypothesis, that there are these extraneous forces controlling our perceptions and presenting themselves as extraterrestrials. He's also suggested that there could be government agencies doing that. Like, example, the CIA might have been doing experiments in
Mhm.
Latin America to make people think that they'd been abducted by aliens. Um, but he hasn't presented any documents to corroborate that particular CIA narrative. He claims that he's going to do that after he dies. That they're going to be released, or like maybe 10 years after he dies. So there are some major issues with the valet, and I initially thought he was one of the serious people, but the more you dig into him, the more you realize that, and I still think that he's sincere in his beliefs, but he's not quite the careful, objective scientist that many people think he is. Erica? I don't know if Erica's gone.
I'm just talking to myself. It happens every
Yeah.
once in a while. I just talk to myself and nobody can hear me. Or I talk to myself and everybody can hear me. And that's so who knows? But yeah, I think, Valet is a really interesting person. And I really would love to have a conversation with him. He's a very iconic figure. And he really has achieved a cult-like status. He's a cult figure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's almost like the Noam Chomsky of ufology.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very interesting, of course. And thanks, Phil. I know I had mute. I don't know. I'm telling you. But yeah. So anyway, I just want to go back over some of the comments in here really quickly because I think there are some good comments. Let's see. Okay. Anyway, yeah. So, and I wanted to say, Phil just had mentioned, going back to the IBM, that Jan Harzan, who is the executive director of MUFON, created the idea for the CMS system and for MUFON. And the question is, was that created by somebody in IBM? So very, very interesting. But
thanks for that.
Yeah.
Phil.
So interesting connections. I appreciate that. And so let's talk a little bit about Bob Lazar, because you wrote you've done some great work on Bob Lazar, and I hate to keep going over this because I think most of us who are listening to this show understand that he's not what he is claiming to be, and he's been involved in some very shady tweets, or excuse me, I'm reading Christopher's comment and trying to focus here, but he's been involved in some shady things over the years, and so can we get into that a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, there are many aspects to Lazar, and
some of it's to do with his, shady dealings with finance and, brothels. But the other part is, his claims about alien technology and working for the supposed S4 facility out near Papoose Lake, which doesn't actually exist. There's no facility there where he says there is, but that's the core of his story, is that he was working at that place and working on the reverse engineering program to try to get to the bottom of how this so-called sport model flying saucer works. But recently I made a video about him talking about, let's just bring it up. This video where I assess his claims about element 115 and flying saucer physics. And now here I talk about some of the discrepancies between his claims back in the early 90s and then that simply don't make sense from a physics point of view. So he talks about how, first of all, he was the one who identified element 115. Okay, that's an actual quote by him from a 1990 interview with Michael Lindemann. That was in a book published by Michael called UFOs and the Alien Presence. And this later became the basis for a documentary, I think in 1992. But this interview had a number of claims by Lazar in which he said things like that he was the first one to identify element 115. And he wasn't actually sure whether it was 115. He said it might have been 114. Okay. and that was his only contribution to the project. Okay, so that was a very early interview. He also made claims about, so here he is. Michael's asking him, so your contribution was identifying this stuff? Bob Lazar, yes. And there again, this confirms what I said, that this project was apparently being worked on for some time, several years, I would imagine, and they had no idea what the fuel was. So in other words, it's saying that they had these objects, these flying saucers, in their care, and they'd been working on them for years, but they had never bothered to figure out what the element was. And he had to come in and figure it out, even though he doesn't know whether it's actually 115 or 114. So here he says, I was the one who identified 115. That was my only contribution to the project. And I don't stand on the fact that it's 115, but if it's not, it's 114. Right? So these sorts of contradictions are typical of Lazar, and they actually keep changing over time. Like little elements of his story keep changing, but people think that he's telling this really consistent story and that therefore he must be telling the truth. So I mentioned a bunch of that stuff. Obviously, element 115, that had been already talked about since the 1970s. And I give scientific references to that in my article in ufologyiscorrupt.com and also some of my previous videos about Lazar. But also element 114 had been synthesized, and that had also been talked about way before Lazar ever did, but it was also eventually synthesized, different isotopes of it, none of them stable. Okay, so the same problem with element 115 is that you got the synthesis of element 115, but none of the isotopes were stable. And so those sorts of problems abound in his story. He's never stood in front of a scientific panel to discuss his so-called knowledge. You know, you would expect a so-called physicist, which he claims that he was at LANL. He was actually a electronics technician hired by Kirk Meyer. And he was contracted labor, okay, working at LANL. He was never a physicist there, but he claims that he was. So an actual physicist would have no problem standing in front of a panel of scientists to discuss his knowledge, but he's never done that. Okay, those are the half-lives of 114 for the isotopes that have been synthesized so far. This is the famous 1989 article in Scientific American, which appeared just a few weeks before Lazar came out with his story. This article mentions not just element 115, but also element 114. Okay, so there's a reference to 114. Another one, some other ones there, and then element 115. Okay. So he says that the alien fuel is a stable element, a stable isotope, and that probably the aliens did not produce it in a particle accelerator, that they had to have gotten it from a supernova explosion remnant. Okay, so in other words, that the element 115 was available to them in their area of the universe or the galaxy, but we don't find any element 115 on Earth. Okay, in the geological record, we don't find any. We haven't found any in the solar system, and that's problematic. If this is a naturally occurring element, then we would expect at least a little bit of it to be found, but we haven't found any naturally occurring. Now, it's still conceivable that you could find some elsewhere in the universe, but then how does synthesizing it in a lab validate Lazar's story? Because people say that, when it was eventually synthesized, and this was just a few atoms of element 115, that it somehow validated everything that he'd said. In fact, it does the opposite, because Lazar himself says that the aliens would not have gotten it from a particle accelerator. So another contradiction. The actual isotope that he touts as the stable isotope is 299, but this only ever appeared on his website, with selling merchandise. So this is from a T-shirt or a mug on his website. This was way after he first told his story, and he never mentioned the isotope in the early interviews. This was way after. So I don't know where he got this. He might have gotten it from someone else, but it certainly was not being mentioned early on. Right. He also makes really strange claims, or he did back in the day, that element 115 has got special gravitational properties. So you could just have a piece of it on a table and it's enough to bend light away from it. Like just a little piece on a table can bend a laser light. However, that's ridiculous, because in order to have that sort of effect, you would need basically a black hole. Okay, there's no way you could manipulate that piece of element 115. And it would probably destroy the Earth. Okay, so that's completely ridiculous. Then later on, he even says that they were machining the element 115. So that Lanel was receiving pieces of element 115 and then machining it into pieces to use in the flying saucer tests. There's no way to machine something like that if it's having that sort of gravitational effect. Okay, there's problems with a spectrograph story as well. So here it talks about like how he's asked, like, how did he actually determine it was element 115? And then the interviewer asks, was there a spectrograph used? Lazar says, yes, there was certainly a spectrograph, but Lazar has never actually reproduced the spectrograph. So he even said in a 1993 interview in Rachel, Nevada, that, well, here's what he says in the first interview. Certainly a mass spectrograph was one way of determining element 115. So that's from the 1990 interview. And then later on in 1993, he says, well, no, I haven't seen any spectrographic analysis on it. Or, well, actually, they did do. I don't know if I saw it, though. I wouldn't be able to identify the lines. No. So in other words, he's supposedly the person who was brought in to determine the element, yet he can't remember if he saw spectrographic analysis of that very element. So that doesn't make any sense at all. And it goes on like that. So many of these sorts of problems. There's even element 116 brought into the picture. So in the 1990 interview, he says that element 115 converts to element 116, but then how did he determine that? So that's not mentioned or explained. And that maybe the government has got 500 pounds of element 115. So that's completely ridiculous to think that they could acquire that much material, from whatever, the aliens or some other method. Yeah, he even said that you can lift a small piece of element 115 and that you can tell that it's much heavier than lead, which is another type of metal. Okay, how can you possibly lift element 115 if you just said that it can bend light? Okay, if it's got that sort of gravitational effect, then you can't lift it, let alone tell that it's heavier than lead. So it's basically just spouting magic. This is not science. This is just pure magic. But because people in the US are kind of, I blame it on the education system, that people just basically believe anybody who appears to be smart, and they don't really scrutinize somebody's beliefs or claims if that person gives the impression of being honest, which many people think that Lazar appears to be honest. Okay. This is about mentioning an institution. In his video, in the Lazar tape, this is from, I think, 92. Lazar made this video with Gene Huff called the Lazar tapes and excerpts from the government Bible. And he mentioned an institute in Germany which had been doing research into heavy elements. And this was the exact institution that was mentioned in the 1989 Scientific American article. So he drew multiple themes from that very article in Scientific American, undoubtedly. And I don't know, Erica, do you want me to keep going? But
No, I do. Yeah.
the other thing is the explosion at S4. So he conveys a story that these technicians before him, before he was initiated into the program, had died because they had been, hired to work on the spacecraft, and they were trying to cut open the alien reactor with a plasma cutter, and then they blew themselves up. And here you can see again Lazar contradicting himself. First, he says that you couldn't get a nuclear explosion from the reactor, and then he says that, oh yes, there was a nuclear explosion. It was as powerful as a 20 kiloton explosion. So another contradiction there. Explosion at the Nevada test site. So first he says it's too stable for that, and then it was a good bang, I'd say in the 20 kiloton range. There's also a problem about the Nevada test site, which is that we know all of the nuclear tests that happened because the Department of Energy has released that information. They released it in the 1990s, and we can actually check the dates of these explosions and the approximate yields and so on. So there's a document here from the DOE. This was from 2000, but there was a previous one which had been released. I think this was the definitive version. U.S. nuclear tests, July 1945 through September 92. And this lists all of the nuclear explosions at the Nevada test site and other sites as well that the U.S. has conducted tests, such as the Pacific Ocean. But if you actually go through the tests and the test series, you'll see that they don't correspond to the claimed explosion at, the alien reactor exploding and had to be passed off as a nuclear explosion. So the dates don't line up. I explained all of this in this video in more detail if you're interested, but that's just giving you a kind of brief overview. So that doesn't matter.
Wonderful. And that's a great video. People need to go to your YouTube channel and watch that.
Also, Tom Mahood has got some good stuff as well on otherhand.org. So he's somebody who's really delved deep into the Lazar story and found many problems with it. Okay, the level of power of the reactor. So he's asked, how much power is the reactor developing? Bob Lazar says a tremendous amount. I don't remember specifically. And then the interviewer asks megawatts. And then Lazar says it was greater than megawatts. I seem to remember 100 or 200 megawatts. So what does he mean by seems to remember? Like, isn't he meant to be a physicist who was on that project specifically to reverse engineer the propulsion system, but he can't remember what the power output was? So again, that doesn't make any sense. And then he gets to the Cash-Landrum incident, okay, which was an incident in 1980 involving 3 people, 2 women and the grandson of one of them. And this was a famous UFO case, and it's often still held up as a very important and convincing case. But Lazar also tried to tap into that story by saying that maybe the diamond-shaped UFO that was seen by Vicky and Betty was a secret test which had gone wrong. So a UFO which was made by the government, and it was leaking radiation because the system had malfunctioned. And this is linked to, of course, the symptoms that they exhibited afterwards. But there are some problems with that as well. But the point here is that Lazar is trying to tap into that story, and he's trying to say that instead of using element 115, they used plutonium, but it wasn't a very efficient alternative. However, plutonium does not have any special gravitational properties, so it can't be the basis for a similar type of reverse engineered spacecraft if it's using gravity manipulation, okay? So that's incongruent. And then there's the problems with the Cash-Landrum case itself, which I think it's a very interesting case, but maybe not for the reasons that many people think. So this is why I think it's not necessarily a great case. Well, I stated it pretty explicitly here that I don't think it's a good case, but you might disagree. But here are some problems with it. That ionizing radiation, sufficient to have produced the supposed physiological symptoms, would invariably have been fatal. So the women exhibited these symptoms like hair loss and lesions and so on, nausea, vomiting. And if they had exhibited those symptoms to that extent so quickly from ionizing radiation, then they would have died. Definitely, they would have died from that, but they didn't. In fact, they lived many more years after the incident. So something else could have caused their symptoms, but it definitely was not radiation or ionizing radiation.
And that's interesting because, again, that's kind of used at Skinwalker Ranch, right?
Yeah, there is a radiation aspect there where supposedly there are these anomalies involving equipment malfunctions, like computers switch off or they don't turn on, or electronic equipment starts acting up. And also, I don't know if there's been any indication of sickness at Skinwalker from radiation.
Yeah, that's one of the things. I think Travis Taylor was had some sort of radiation injury, and I think that has been kind of used over and over again as there's some sort of radiation people are exposed to. And again, I always just kind of throw out there, if that was really the case, they wouldn't be filming a TV show, but that there is
So. And Jacques Vallée actually has also brought up the issue of microwave radiation quite a bit, that it could be a cause for people seeing UFOs, but that the controllers, as he calls them, are trying to induce a UFO vision in the witness by using microwave radiation. But radiation has also appeared in movies and other media where people who have encountered UFOs develop skin lesions from mutations in their DNA. So it's certainly been a big theme. Then there's the problem that no burn mark on the road was actually ever identified. There was no handprint by Landrum on the supposedly heated vinyl dashboard. Okay, she claimed that she put her hand on the dashboard and it was so hot that it left an imprint of her hand, but in fact that was never photographed or documented. The medical records have never been released, and that makes it difficult to actually verify what the symptoms really were and whether it could have been caused by some sort of radiation. So that's supposedly on privacy grounds that it's not been released. And one of the investigators, and Robert Schieffer actually has got a really good piece on the Cash-Landrum case, but he talks about how one of the people who wrote a book about the Cash-Landrum incident, he is the one who's protected the medical records and does not want to release them. So that's also kind of sus, I think. There was a lawsuit that they filed against the government for damages for $20 million, but the judge threw it out on lack of evidence. So there could have been a cash grab component to this, or that could have just come afterwards. So maybe they did see something strange, but they wanted to blame the government. But anyway, the court threw that out.
But I mean, I have to say, being the devil's advocate here, though, I mean, people are exposed to things at the hands of the government.
Yes.
When you look at what has taken place at Dugway Proving Ground and things, and so
for
potentially
sure.
maybe
People are entitled
to something. But
if people actually have been exposed to dangerous chemicals or radiation, and that's due to government negligence, then absolutely they should take the government to court and sue them. But I think in this case, maybe they saw something and they attributed it to the government, and they kind of latched onto that story, that government connection.
Interesting. It'll be an interesting thing to bring on some people to the show to
Yeah.
debate the Cash-Landrum case, because that really is a fascinating case. And I know John Schuessler from MUFON and John Alexander both investigated that case quite thoroughly. So it's fascinating.
John Alexander actually contacted the military person who was the liaison with the court case, who supposedly checked into the Chinook helicopters, which the witnesses claimed they saw circling the UFO. But according to this government worker, there were no records of any Chinooks in the area, let alone that many. So, you can take that as you want. Maybe the government was just covering up for the government, but nevertheless, we don't have an affirmation that there were that many helicopters in that area. There was also some question about the fact that they were Chinook helicopters, because the Air Force did not have that type of helicopter back then. And the witnesses were very adamant that they saw U.S. Air Force printed on the side of the helicopters. But in fact, the Air Force didn't have them. I think the National Guard and the Marine Corps did, but not the Air Force. Yeah, so again, whatever the facts about the Cash-Landrum case, it's undoubtedly the case that Lazar is once again trying to tap into that UFO lore, as he's done with many other cases, like, the Betty and Barney Hill case, Zeta Reticuli reference, and lots of other things, including Billy Meier and ancient astronauts stories.
Well, it's really interesting, and I've, if I can find this here, I found in Andruffel's files. This is from the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. This was way back when, our extraterrestrial heritage from UFOs to space colonies. And let me just look at the date here. This is really interesting, 1978. And they were mentioning Zeta Reticuli and different things. So fascinating the way that this has been put into the narrative. I don't know. We'll see.
Zeta Reticuli was discredited as a possible source for the aliens that Betty and Barney Hill supposedly saw. But, it became part of Lazar's story because it was already popular by then. And, kind of tapping into existing UFO lore in order to spice it up with his own story and quote unquote affirm other people's beliefs and suspicions by saying, oh yeah, this stuff is actually true. And I initially thought it was crazy, but now that I've worked in this reverse engineering program, I can tell you that it's all true. So that sort of thing.
Interesting. And so let's, and keep going here with the, with your slides.
Just here about the Landrum case, Lazar is saying that the government in 1980, so this is almost a decade before his own story comes out in 1989, he's saying that the government was already able to fly a plutonium-powered exotic craft near civilian areas, no less, using some sort of basic gravity manipulation technique similar to the sport model. But they were screwing around at S4 by cutting into live alien reactors because no one knew any better, right? So he's attributing basic mastery of the technology to the government, and then he's saying that they had no idea what they were doing. They didn't even know the element they were working with, and they had to get him on board to figure that out. So again, that doesn't make any sense at all. Okay. He basically says that nobody at S4 knew what they were doing, except maybe him, even though he says he didn't know if it was element 114 or 115 that he was dealing with. So even he basically didn't know what he was doing. So the staff at S4 don't know what they're doing. The dumbass technicians at S4 who blew themselves up, they don't know what they're doing either. Lanel didn't know what they were doing. And even Lazar doesn't know what he's doing. And yet they're able to fly these flying saucers at S4 and even do like zigzag motions, according to Gene Huff, because he went out with Lazar and John Lear
to supposedly view test flights near Papoose, where Gene Huff was describing like that the flying saucer was doing this sort of zigzag motions. So that would imply that they've basically mastered how to fly the things, and yet here Lazar is saying that nobody knows what they're doing.
I can't say I'm shocked.
Mm-hmm. Plutonium has got no magical gravitational properties. Okay, we've been using it since the 1940s in nuclear weapons. Just some more about the Cash-Landrum case. And then this is a big fuck you from Bob to his fans. Sorry to use that language, but it's true. So he says, I feel like I really know what's going on and everyone's an idiot. I really do feel that way. So it's kind of like he sneaks like these little taunts into his story where he tells people that they're morons for believing him, but then he keeps feeding them more of the same story. And I think that's probably part of his motivation, is to feel superior or smarter than other people. And we shouldn't assume that it's just for money, because a lot of people really do their hoaxes not for money primarily, but for reasons of self-esteem and to sort of pump themselves up and to feel better. So that could be part of it as well.
I think that explains quite a few people that are key figures in ufology, but ego, it seems to be so fragile and yet so dominant. Well, and so I want to just ask you, because I've got some questions in chat that are really good, but let me tell us about Billy Meyer.
Now, Billy Meyer. So Billy Meyer is a Swiss dude. He's got a really interesting story. His background is basically, and this is something that comes up again and again among these UFO grifters, is that they've got this kind of dodgy side in terms of their personal life. So Meyer was kind of a vagrant, and he escaped from prison, I think, in Switzerland, and then he was basically a drifter for a while, and then he turned himself in, but then he kept doing that sort of stuff. He eventually came upon this idea of tricking people with a UFO story and saying that he was in contact with Plegiarans from the Pleiades star system. So these Nordic aliens, and his main point of communication was Semyasi, one of the aliens. But there were some other ones like Ptah and somebody else. So a pantheon of alien gods, basically, who were giving him information about the alien civilization and Earth's history and stuff like that, and some details about how the alien technology works, which incidentally is very similar to Lazar's description. Now, so he's been doing this for decades now, and he's been putting out these contact reports where he conveys conversations that he's had with Semyasi and other Plegiarans, and it's just basically fan fiction. But he also claims to be a prophet, and that even the reincarnation of Jesus and Muhammad. Okay, so a religious aspect here for sure. Now, John Lear, who was associated with Bob Lazar, he actually was initially skeptical of Billy Meyer's story, but then he became a proponent of it. And it's interesting that the sport model that Lazar talks about, that he says he worked on, is basically a carbon copy of a beamship saucer from the Billy Meyer mythos. So definitely he got that from listening to John Lear. So that's sort of the connection between Meyer and Bob Lazar. It's through John Lear. But Meyer is still doing this stuff to this day. He's still making these contact reports and claiming all kinds of crazy things. And Lazar has basically admitted that Meyer is crazy,
but that didn't stop him from plagiarizing the beam ship.
And so you were mentioning a little bit about Bill Cooper and
Yeah.
John Lear and things. And let's talk about Bill Cooper for a minute, because that talk about it, an interesting and incredibly unstable human being. I would say
Mhm.
he would be on the top of that list. But give us a little information on him and some of the areas that you're looking into with regard to his life and work.
Yeah, so he was one of the dons of conspiracism in the US. And he was pushing the story that the US government had engineered the HIV virus, which causes AIDS, in order to kill Black people and homosexuals. So Cooper, his sort of framework for understanding the world was very similar to that of many white supremacists, but he was not himself a white supremacist, even though he was maybe on the far right. And oh, sorry, there it goes. So he was saying that the government was targeting Black people and homosexuals, and so he was not pushing a white supremacist view of things, but his conspiracy theory about the world was very similar in structure to how many, white supremacists see Jews controlling the world, for example, and stuff like that. The Illuminati, and very similar to David Icke, who's still prominent and pushing Illuminati conspiracies. Bill Cooper was somewhat into the alien conspiracy stuff as well. He had contact with John Lear, who conveyed stories to Bill Cooper, and also, I think, conveyed stories about the Paul Benowitz affair. So this also fed into Bill Cooper's worldview, and Cooper eventually died from gunshot wounds in a shootout with the police, because they'd come after him for tax evasion, and he'd resisted getting arrested, and so he was killed in that confrontation. But he had a radio show as well, and it was widely listened to by many people. I think Timothy McVeigh may have listened to his stuff. I could be wrong about that, but McVeigh was certainly a conspiracist. And Cooper was... There's actually a good book called Conspiracy Nation by Peter Knight, or edited by Peter Knight. It's a collection of essays about conspiracies and conspiracy thought in America. And still have to read that, but I've started reading it, but it's got some discussion there about Bill Cooper's ideology and how it's kind of found traction among many Americans. Now, one of the interesting things about conspiracism is that it's no longer the exclusive preserve of the far right or the far left. It's actually become more popular among mainstream America. So it's not just on the fringe, it's actually elements of it are held by many people. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so partly X-Files and other fictional narratives have kind of helped that. And Americans have become kind of cynical about the government and corporations. And so it's very easy for conspiratorial thinking to seep in and become the norm. But I don't want to say that conspiracism is always wrong, because some parts of it I think are correct, but it just obviously goes way too far. But interestingly, it's become more mainstream, especially now, as we saw with the January insurrection and things like that. And the ease with which the GOP especially can throw out these outrageous claims about Obama or about Biden with no evidence, and they just get accepted by people.
I know it really is. And I think so. It is a sad state when people believe some of this stuff, and I think it's been very detrimental all over the world. I mean, I think our political climate and knowing what's taking place, in Ukraine and some of the things, it's really frightening to see how some of these conspiracy theories are used by other leaders, and the catastrophic effects that can have. It's I don't know. It's a very interesting time, and I think we need to get things in check a little bit, and really, and I do appreciate the fact that you are looking at some of these things and some of the people and the myths that they've promoted, some of the dangerous ideology that we've seen coming out of people that, I mean, either they're mentally ill, on the payroll, driven by ego, and a narcissistic need for some sort of adulation. But there, I mean, it is really sad to see how much of this has got hold, and how
Yeah.
really, really, really incredible people that I know and love have been affected by this, and have as a result, have been uh, isolated from their families, have lost jobs. I mean, there's some really serious implications to some of the things that are taking place with all of this. And a lot of this, if you look back to coast, a lot of this stuff really came from coast to coast, and some of the things that they've been promoting over the years.
Yes. There's also another point that I should mention about conspiracism, which is that it isn't simply a fringe political, extreme political view or something that mentally ill people think. It's also kind of a poor man's shorthand for thinking about the world, because the world is so complex, especially with globalization and technology and all the ways that it interacts with our lives, that many people adopt a kind of shorthand way of thinking about how the world actually works. And conspiracism is a kind of very convenient way of doing that. And then there's the related aspect, which is that people feel a kind of alienation in society and a loss of personal autonomy because of overwhelming bureaucracy or whatever the case may be. And so in order to reattain personal agency, they have to believe that it's still possible in the world, even if they attribute it to some hidden force. So the Illuminati or whoever still has got power, but maybe if we expose them, we can also take the power back. So those two things, I think, are interacting, and they are also an important and often overlooked aspect of conspiracism in America.
Right. And I just want to say, and I appreciate all of these wonderful comments you guys are making. I mean, as always, I wouldn't expect anything less from people that listen to the show. You guys are very thoughtful and intelligent about things. But B. Baker had mentioned that it seems like the right wing is a generic boogeyman for you, and I'm sure the same could be said for me. I don't think it's a boogeyman. I live in the state of Utah, where people who are in prominent positions in the Republican Party are using some of these conspiracy theories to further their agenda and to get reelected. I mean, that's fact. And I think that there is that. I mean, there are obviously problems on both sides. Politics is corrupt. I don't know what to say, but I do. I feel that in the ufological community, there is a very, very interesting bent to all of this, and to me, it's disturbing. I think the extremist ideas, I think some of the white supremacist ideas are really, really alarming, and I don't understand why people in the UFO subject who are the leaders, aren't calling this out. But I guess, who am I kidding? They're a part of it, or they're lazy, or they just want to get paid. But it's
I think
fascinating.
in UFOs in general, or the UFO field, the far right is more using it more than the far left, I would say. But there is a mix of political ideas in ufology. So probably the most people who believe in UFOs, they are centrist or even left-leaning to an extent. But when it comes to the actual leadership of the UFO movement, like the people who are actually putting out ideas about what's going on and writing books and so on, they tend to be more conservative. So I think that's an interesting kind of dichotomy there.
And absolutely, and thank you, Matthew, for the super sticker. That is awesome. And again, I'm sorry to keep saying this, but I love looking at your comments. You guys are so Amazing. Thank you. And I need to have a show where, again, all of you are calling in and sharing your information and your ideas with me, because you guys give me great things to think about. So thank you. And so, I mean, I don't know. Where are you going now with your research? What are you going to be focusing on?
Probably on the ranch that cannot be named, and the links between consciousness research and UFOs, because I see it as a broader thing than just UFOs. It's kind of like an attack on the Enlightenment and an attack on scientific materialism. And I think that that is a big part of what's motivating UFO belief these days. It's becoming more detached from what's called a nuts and bolts approach to a more kind of woo, new age consciousness type of thing. So I think that's extremely interesting. And that has something to say about maybe the yearnings and needs and anxieties of people in society more generally, could be animating these discussions.
That'll be interesting. And I hope that when you start digging into the ranch that can't be named, definitely look into uh, Joe Firmage, who was an important
Yeah.
figure in the UFO community. Actually donated quite a bit of money to different people in attempts to solve the UFO mystery. And I know that some of the team at the new Skinwalker ranch, they've been very public about making comments about him and saying that this person was bilking millions of dollars out of Carl Sagan's widow, out of people in the military, A, B, C, and D, which in and of itself, I can't imagine, that could be, I mean, talk about legal,
Yeah,
a
for sure.
legal angle there. Somebody could definitely pursue
Mhm.
that. But so I think that is really interesting that that is kind of thrown in there. And why is there such a push to throw this person under the bus? What happened there? You go back and you look at the little gyroscope experiments with Kit Green and Fugal and things. That's always an input off. I mean, that's an interesting thing. So definitely look into that. I know for me personally, and I'll just divulge this. I know that with the Joe Firmage thing, I had a few years ago, former retired deputy sheriff Bo Babka, a very controversial figure in Utah, and a couple other people come into my studio and give me information about Joe Firmage and how he had allegedly bilked millions of dollars out of people. And I feel that that was potentially on either that was part of uh, some sort of narrative that was desperately trying to be promoted by the new ownership and their team. And I wonder what that is about. And at the end of the day, if you're truly a good person of faith, of the LDS faith, you certainly wouldn't be throwing somebody like that under the bus without providing good evidence. That's very shameful. And also, on that note, I want to just mention Garth Myers, who, again, by this group of people, has been thrown under the bus about, and allegedly he is lying about the fact there was nothing paranormal taking place at the ranch for the many years that the family owned it. And I have seen Fugel and his team go on social media and say that a person that is a pillar of the Mormon community, the LDS community here, and was a doctor, was a bishop, and a very kind individual, was a liar. And I don't think that's necessarily a good trait of a person that truly believes in the teachings of the LDS religion. So I definitely think some of those things need to be looked into.
Yeah.
And I know I've been collecting quite a bit of evidence about all of these shenanigans over the years, and I'm lucky that I've given all of that evidence to other people in my orbit, and they're looking into this as well. So
Hmm.
I just had to
Yes.
throw that in there.
Yeah.
So I look forward to helping you, any way I can, putting this pieces of the puzzle together. And Also, looking at, I think another thing would be that would be really interesting is to look at some of the things going on with the UFO conferences that are now being held in Vernal, Utah, and is there who's funding these conferences? Is this something that is there potential funding our taxpayer money going into the conferences? How accessible are they to other people in the community that are trying to, promote tourism to their properties and things? And I know that also there has been, and sorry to go off on this little tangent, but I think this is really interesting. I know that people that are in the area that are trying to do some really, really cool things have been threatened with lawsuits. And I don't know if anybody knew this, but the Skinwalker name has been trademarked. So
Hmm.
interesting. That
Yeah,
fascinating.
I'll certainly look into all those aspects.
Yeah, it'll be fun to look into all of them. But it's really, at the end of the day, it's pretty interesting to look at, and I definitely think it's important for people to understand because, like I said, there's something genuine, there's something real. This should be a fun, exploratory process, and we should be, this is the search for extraterrestrial life, the search to understand, our world and some of the things that happen to each and every one of us. That should be a fun and empowering endeavor that isn't commandeered by people that are trying to make money or promote, uh, you know, uh, some of their ideas that are really detrimental to other human beings and their lives. So that's just me.
My attitude is wake me up when the aliens say hello. In terms of, I think when aliens do make contact with us, if they ever do, it'll be unambiguous. Um, Instead of all this stuff which you have to sort of squint and play little games in order to believe is actually proof. So it'll be something unambiguous and clear, and everyone will agree on it because the evidence will be there. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of good research on astrobiology, which is an actual field of science. And when it comes to ufology, however, it seems like ufology just sort of lends itself to so much crazy speculation with no evidence to back it up. And that's the difference between something like astrobiology and ufology as it's currently set up anyway.
Absolutely. It's really, yeah, the whole thing is interesting. And I just want to say, Simon mentions in here that I should write a book on the shenanigans at the ranch that shall not be named. And I don't think that book hasn't already been started. It's going to be a good one. Just putting that out there. So interesting stuff. And I want to, yeah, just again, go back and thank Alvaro and Steve and Scott and everybody from, Phil, everyone, Sparky Lady, everybody from all over the world that listen to this show. I think it is so cool. And if Steve is listening over there in the UK, I want to say congratulations on your beautiful granddaughter. That is so exciting. I saw the pictures on Facebook, and it's so much fun to have just a new young life in there. And Amy Collins, I give Dinah a big hug for me. Dinah is the coolest cat next to Mufasa on the planet. And I'm sorry that Mufasa hasn't been here this evening. Clearly, I kept him up too late last night. But so tell everybody where we can find out. Obviously, you have this wonderful blog, Ufology is Corrupt. And then you also have a video channel on YouTube under your name and
Yeah.
things. Is there another place where people can find you, or that give us more information?
Oh, those are the places.
Okay.
Mhm.
And
And
it's
I try to
great.
put up material at least once a month, but sometimes I can't. But try to just sort of keep up with what's going on. Certainly not as detailed as somebody like Jack Brewer, but at least I try to sort of
give a kind of contour picture of what's going on. And yeah, the channel is not necessarily about UFOs. It's also about other things in science and about politics, but I do try to give some commentary on UFOs. So I've got 4 videos about Lazar now, and I've also got some articles about Lazar, and about I'm going to put in some articles about Alan Steinfeld's book, Making Contact, which I recommend everyone read that book out of the entertainment value. But that's certainly a book that deserves a lot of scrutiny because it kind of encapsulates the consciousness aspect of UFOs now. So I find that very endlessly interesting, actually. Even though I don't believe a word of what he says, I think there is still an underlying truth. It's just that he doesn't realize that truth, but he articulates it in his own way. So I find that really interesting. And I also find the sort of corruption aspect interesting about political and financial ties. So that's going to be the focus of a lot of other articles that I'll put up.
Good. Well, good luck with that. We know that's a fun area to look into. And people clearly don't want anybody messing around in that cat box, but there's a lot to be said there, and I think that's where a lot of this comes into play. And there are people who've made a great deal of money on this subject over the years, and they're hiding their shady business dealings and things like that. But so it's always interesting. And again, thanks you guys, and thank you for being on the show. I love talking to you. I love reading your blog and watching your videos because they make me, you have such a dry sense of humor, and sometimes you say things and I just laugh because it's brilliant. So
thank you.
Really appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely. And for all of my listeners, thank you again for being here. Thank you for supporting the show and becoming Patreons. I'm getting new Patreons all the time. I appreciate you very, very much. That pays for the show costs. We're just starting to cover the show costs, and hopefully we can also start really honing in on archiving because this is expensive, and clearly I need some things to make sure I'm archiving and digitizing 140,000 plus documents and audio cassettes and things, and making sure that the public gets this information because it really truly is fascinating, and we need to make sure that we are preserving history and learning from history. This is really, really cool. So you guys, thank you, Peter, for putting everything out. You guys take care, and thank you, and I hope you have a great weekend. Stay out of trouble.
Thank you. You
Yep.
too.
Well, I mean, granted, I might need to take a nap, but I'm sure I'll get into some trouble. So thank you. And then I'm hoping you guys, Dave Beatty will be here next week. He's waiting for a certain some things to drop, and if that is the case, that would be wonderful. But I've got some really great guests lined up in the next month. So stay tuned, and I love you guys. Be safe. Thank you very much, and I will catch you guys next Friday.